Negative emotions. The question arises as to whether or not it is helpful to try not to express our dislike of other people, even though one dislikes them in their thoughts. It is useless acting on some small phrase in the work unless we understand the meaning of it. Why should I, for example, not express my negative emotions freely? In life, this is considered quite legitimate. However, in any work on self, that is not the case. If we fall under the influence of life with its minimal opportunities for development, where the dice are heavily loaded against us when it comes to inner growth, there is no reason why we should not react to everything mechanically according to our level of being. But if we seek to be in any sort of work, then we fall under another aspect of things entirely and begin to shoulder a new responsibility, which means that we cannot behave just as we choose to anymore. When this moment occurs in us, when a realization of the meaning of work begins to become apparent, we are no longer able to do just as we please from the point of view of self-will. This means we cannot react mechanically in the same way that we have always done, because we begin to feel responsible to another order of behavior, one that we must begin to obey, as otherwise the work will have no effect on us at all and end up being a huge waste of time. How can the ideas of work have any effect if we simply go about behaving as we always have done, which means reacting mechanically? Everyone has their own mechanical way of reacting to things. However, the objective of this work is to change that mechanicalness. When you have reached a certain point in work, you begin to feel uncomfortable when you behave mechanically. Begin to dislike your continued mechanical reaction to all events, people, and to anything that arises. As when this begins to happen, you are beginning to pass under the laws of this work, beginning to understand that we cannot live as before, to realize that we have to do something about the matter ourselves and pick up the reins, so to speak. So what then is to be done? To begin with, we have to try to do what the work teaches, which is an extraordinary experience to realize. That we not only have to behave, but henceforth to think and to feel differently. Remember here that everyone thinks that they behave quite responsibly. It takes some time before one realizes that we do not behave correctly, never have done so in fact. It takes a while to realize that our ordinary way of behaving, internally and externally, is not what the work teaches. Gradually, therefore, we come to an epiphany, that what this work has been teaching all along applies to us directly and to the way that we behave, think, or feel. It may take years before that moment of realization strikes home. We may talk about the work, we may be interested in it, and feel in a sense that we are in the work, yet fail to notice that we do not live the work as a form of practice in our daily lives. There are numerous reasons why this moment of realization is not touched upon for some time. One is because no one is allowed to understand the work until they are ready to understand it. When the ideas of work become emotional and begin to relate themselves personally to us and to all that we have observed in ourselves, then we may have a moment of realization of what this work means practically. The work says, in general, that we should not express our negative emotions, that the more we express them, the more they feed on us and are sustained by our behavior. Suppose, therefore, that a person simply hears this remark and then repeats it to other people without realizing what it means and what connection it has with work ideas. Taking this statement of the work quite apart from the whole context of work, we imagine it nothing more than some kind of commandment that we are told to obey. So let's run with that and create the commandment, then call it the 11th commandment. I believe the 11th commandment has already been invented. Thou shalt not be found out. So let's therefore take the commandment, thou shalt not be negative, as the 12th commandment. The work says we must not be negative, that we should not express our negative emotions. An individual who follows this commandment, literally someone who flatters themselves that they obey it, which of course they do not, is nothing but deluded and taking the work on a very external or subjective level. They may not express negative emotions in public, but express them in private, either to their inner circle they think of as friends, or in some secret thoughts. They will then think that the whole idea of not expressing negative emotions consists of obeying an external commandment. However, the work teaches that negative emotions must gradually be eliminated. For as long as we enjoy the effect of negative emotions, we are cut off from any contact with higher centers. At a certain stage of work, even a moment's indulgence of negativity towards others will cause us to lose force, even destroy in that moment everything that we have aimed at in a work sense. Negative emotion cuts us off from any possibility of help. To become thoroughly negative is like an explosion in a delicate chemical laboratory, through which everything that is being made, being gradually created, is destroyed in that instant. At all costs, our mechanical reactions which produce negative emotions, our judgment of others, and our vanities when it comes to ourselves, must be mitigated and separated from in order to maintain any degree of inner psychological health. When we become aware that we cannot afford to be negative, then it will no longer be a commandment that we obey in this regard, but a matter of deeper understanding. Life and all of its events will then become our teacher. We will no longer think of obeying some external rules, some dogma or commandments, but see for ourselves the reason why. Then we will hesitate before plunging into the welter of negative states, whether expressed externally or not. Consider whether it may be helpful to try to act outwardly as though liking a person while inwardly disliking that individual. This would be a wonderful thing if we could only act, however only conscious people can act, because acting is doing in a work sense. What we call acting normally is something that would break down instantly because we are acting from self-love and from some picture of ourselves. For example, if we were determined to act very pleasantly towards someone, then come into the room and say, most politely, "Will you have some more tea?" But the person says that they never drink tea, then we feel offended and upset, saying to ourselves, "Well, I've done my best." This is the only kind of acting that we can do at our level, and is more a form of pretense. There is nothing genuine in it, and it would be a source of fresh and vigorous negative emotion. However, if, through external considering, we were genuinely concerned about the other person, then perhaps our acting would be from some deeper source. We can always test our so-called acting ability by noticing the point where we become irritated, then see the difference between acting from internal considering and acting from external considering. P.D. Uspensky would say, "Only someone who can do can act. Acting is doing, and only a conscious person can act." This means that only from real being, from real I, can a person act in any real sense, from beyond themselves, beyond personality. In discussing whether or not it is helpful to attempt not to express our dislike of a person, even though we dislike that person in our thoughts, the center of gravity in the question lies in the word helpful. In what sense is it helpful not to express our negative emotions externally? The answer is that if we express them mechanically, they tend to increase and form a habit, one of negative emotions. From the standpoint of ideas of work, what we are aiming to achieve, this is obviously something that would interfere with the possibility of reaching some new level of being. It's certainly not helping us in this regard.
The other part of the question about disliking people in our thoughts would be the same thing if we continued to feel negative towards other people, even though we obey the commandment of not expressing those negative feelings. It might even be better to express them, as to think negatively about others is just the same as behaving negatively. To have an enormous number of negative thoughts about others and to attempt not to show them externally is a very good thing, provided that we know that our task is to alter those negative thoughts within ourselves.
This is, of course, not possible if you take yourself for granted as always being right. If, through long self-observation, you have become aware of many unpleasant things in yourself, then you will be in a position to neutralize your negative thoughts about others through seeing the same things in yourself and so putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Save when we fall asleep in ourselves and allow mechanical negative thoughts to pass unchallenged through our minds. In this regard, it is interesting to notice how we can be negative with a person when we are asleep, and how the whole situation is changed when we awaken. This is one of the first things to realize when alternating between life and work. When we are in life, things appear one way, and when we are in a sense of work, things appear quite differently. So much so that at times we cannot imagine how we behaved, spoke, or felt as we previously did. The explanation is relatively simple. We were asleep. This is a necessary experience and provides the practical method of working on ourselves. People who imagine, having heard this work for a short time, that they are going to behave in some beautiful way are simply misguided. We can only learn to walk by falling. We all have more conscious and more mechanical moments. However, it is through contrast that we learn. Let no one in the work imagine that they have reached some stage where they cannot become negative. The work, in fact, introduces us to the whole technique of dealing with negative states, whether expressed or felt. And herein lies changing terrain that we have to navigate with certain confidence, that we might reach another state of ourselves. The ups and downs cannot be traversed by anyone who imagines that a short passage to their intentions is granted. There is no button press because the source of negative emotions lies very deep in us, and there are some sorely vexed places within that without help we could never avoid. For that reason, we must have a sense of what practical work teaches and why it teaches what it does. When we're in a negative state, whether expressed or not, we are wrongly aligned and cut off from any best thoughts and healthy emotions. No longer obeying the instruction of this work about negative emotions as a commandment. Know and understand why this counsel about negative emotions is given as practice, that it is no external commandment, but one of the deepest things that could possibly be said with regard to reaching a better range of feelings and understanding within ourselves. The satisfaction of being negative, even with very good cause, no longer gives a sense of joy. As if we are negative beyond a certain point, then we will cease to experience inner happiness or peace of mind, which is what we're striving for. It is useless to have our happiness depend upon people and external events. The source of understanding of work does not lie simply in external conditions, and will need to experience more than once that moment of understanding which one of England's mystical writers, Thomas Traherne, when describing a moment of self-remembering, said that he felt he had reached his innermost being. "You will not believe how I was withdrawn from altering and minding outward things," he said. This means to be passive towards life. P.D. Ouspensky taught that we need to become passive to all that happens to us, whatever it might be, and that this is the most difficult thing, because if taken out of context, it leads in quite the wrong direction. Just doing nothing is useless, Ouspensky cautioned, It was the most difficult thing to grasp, as it has nothing to do with quietism and more to do with the path of silent Buddhas. He suggested that the work phrase, realizing that other people are machines, comes closer to the idea, but it's impossible to see that rightly unless we have first seen that we too are machines. We are nearly always negative with other people because we take them as conscious beings, doing things consciously. We also make the mistake of thinking that we are conscious, and so do everything with conscious purpose. None of us will be able to reach this viewpoint, such as we are at our level of being, for some time, and it is best not to try to do so artificially. Nothing is more easy than to regard other people as machines, leaving ourselves out. Nothing easier than to see how another person is misdirected, but leave ourselves out. If we can but see ourselves as lost too, then observe the meandering of others without blame, then we might reach that passive point which lies between the swings of a pendulum, the point from whence real understanding emerges. This is why everyone that is working on themselves must practice, particularly when expressing negative emotions or thinking negatively about others. Just as we can see our own gullibility without being negative, so too can we see the vulnerability of others without being negative about it. We can see what a thing is like and at the same time see what we are like without negative emotions coming into play. When we are negative with another person, it is either due to a feeling of superiority or a lack of understanding of the conditions that individual endures. However we might reflect upon this question, the fact remains that negative emotions are useless and lead nowhere except into the abyss, ultimately to misery and even violence. An important lesson of this work is built around advice to free ourselves from these negative states within and those directed toward other people. Because the more negative eyes that we have, which express themselves openly or privately in our thoughts, the greater danger we are exposed to from those negative eyes which have nurtured themselves at our expense and will turn against us when we deny them. All negative eyes that attack others are within us, and whenever we try to raise our level through inner work, we shall have to meet them all one by one, because they will turn on us with the same ferocity that they turn on other people. One generally thinks that they have no negative eyes. We all have a picture of ourselves as being tolerant, but remain oblivious to what goes on in the background. Remember that our emotional center does not possess a negative part at birth, and that all these negative emotions are acquired from the example of our parents, our teachers, our siblings and peers. In fact, all those we are brought up amongst, even people we have never met. Remember too that as long as the negative part of emotional center is active in us, there can only be either no connection or a very intermittent connection with higher emotional center. The objective of work is to purify ordinary centers for the reception of influences from higher centers. So we must first change mental center and begin thinking in a new way. Then change our emotional center and start to feel things in a new way. This is the task that work lays down for us, and is a futile endeavor to understand unless we feel there is some higher level attainable. With regard to work teaching and not expressing negative emotions, they diminish, which gives rise to a great deal of discussion. It is taught at the beginning of work, before anything is said about thinking negatively of others. You'll find those that claim it is better to have an argument and get it all over with, out in the open, that by expressing their negative emotions they feel better afterwards. Indeed, there is a way to express negative emotions consciously, and it's quite different from expressing them mechanically. The expression of negative emotions mechanically leads only to a worsening situation. But in the moment, we might feel relieved by the outburst.
Remember, though, that those expressed negative emotions travel around to people, exciting their negative emotions in response, and then eventually returning to us amplified. We have to deal with our negative emotions and take responsibility for them, for it is here that work on our internal negative thinking about people comes into play. Some say little or nothing externally, but think and feel a great deal privately, even taking pleasure in registering a cause of fresh negative emotion, although they appear composed outwardly. It sustains some inner need, a flame that constantly burns to some cause. In such a case, there is no real conscience against negative states, which is a toxic internal situation, and there is so much vitriol in their minds which they secretly enjoy. Here enters all close and sincere observation that is a requirement of this work, the acknowledgement of our own unpleasant eyes that are projected onto other people. Remember that we have a right not to be negative, and this is quite different from being told we have no right to be negative. Observe yourself sometimes from the standpoint of your negative states. Be sincere and admit that you are in a negative state. Then say to yourself, I have a right not to be negative. Here, all our understanding of work will arise, and maybe the whole negative state will vanish in that moment. This is a moment of self-remembering, because in all self-remembering we put ourselves under the influences of work, which comes from higher centers, in which no negative states exist.